you brought up a good point, and kind of like one of my fears of like the early talks of communities outside of Minneapolis wanting to address the issue, when the George Floyd
Yeah.
event happened. And as much as a lot of their ideas are coming from a place of love and like coming from a place of restorative justice, is like, like Oregon and Washington are not the same places as Minneapolis, and it's not a one-to-one. And my hope, if they do decide, to expand or go out there, is that like they be very tactful, and what you said is like try to address it on a community level, not on like some kind of like, oh, we have the model, let's apply the model to
Right.
a community, and
Right.
it's like it's I something that I've learned from high school on to college and now as an adult is like thinking, like I had this naive notion, it's like, oh yeah, just follow the model, but that's not necessarily the case. Like even if it's like a different school within the same district, there is like different styles, and like people do things
Politics.
differently,
Mhm.
do things
Yes.
differently, and there's politics, and there's things that kind
Hmm.
of coincide, and like and something that not many people understand about the nonprofit industrial complex that I've like that we've talked, that I don't know if we talked with you about, but I've talked to what my coworkers about, is just that, there's this idea that if we follow the model, everything would be okay. But
Right.
like if we follow that logic, and a community doesn't have those same resources, do not
Hmm.
have the same backing, and do not have the same, people that are passionate about doing the work, the ends, like the plan it doesn't match up, it's not going to work out.
Right.
And so we got to meet communities at where they're at, you know
Exactly.
and identify, and then move forward, because
Yeah.
if that work does not get done first, nothing gets done, you know
Yeah, no, totally. And Brian, I think you're hitting something too, is like along with that meeting where community where they're at and how there's different dynamics and politics at each community and each spot that you're going to do the work. Then it comes down to one of our core values in the work is relationship building and trust. And that
hmm
doesn't come over time. And I think that's when you have to be, boots on the ground, talking to parents, talking to teachers, knocking on doors, spending that time to really learn about the issues, finding and identifying existing leaders. I mean,
hmm
this idea, like, where the nonprofit industrial complex, when that model gets lost, is doing that one shoe fit all type of
hmm
approach, which already makes our educational system and our schools disenfranchise us. It's the reason why you can never find equity in that model,
hmm
because some folks have more resources and have a history of being able to push things to a certain extent. Then there's areas that are maybe at the very beginning of being developed and need way more foundation. Across the board, what we're also talking about is sustainability.
hmm
The fact that a lot of time in industrial, it's very hard to get funding in a nonprofit industrial model to really say it's going to take us about a good 3 to 5 years to actually do our homework, to do
hmm
research, to actually understand the dynamics, to strategically organize something to move something forward. And
yeah.
usually our communities are so much under resourced. There could be moments of crisis where we've got to quickly, like you said, we've got to quickly problem solve, frame something, and move something. But
hmm
that in itself is the reason why sometimes we're always on the catch up. We're not on the proactive side, because
yeah.
it's hard to get funding to say we're going to go and we're going to build that relationship, and we're going to look at it across the board, so that when we do almost, how could I say, we do make that plan of action, it's
hmm
coming from this very informed strategic spot. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier too. As folks that do this work, we can understand that when communities and when folks really get upset, like in this historical moment, they're quick to demand, like, we want this now.
hmm
But then the question is, well, what are your demands and what do you want? And what is the politic, like, what's the dynamic that's going on? And are we strategic about that demand?
Exactly. And something that I feel very, I wouldn't say disenfranchised, but kind of frustrated with this kind of like nonprofit kind of sphere, is that, sometimes funding can be corporate funding, and like, and as much as like the money flows and people are getting paid and stuff like that, sometimes the ask, like, and there's nothing wrong about getting money from Bank of America, and then there's nothing necessarily wrong too much about getting money from SoCal Edison and I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble on naming people, but it's the thing is sometimes they ask certain things that the community doesn't necessarily need, or like the community doesn't necessarily find as important, and it doesn't meet them in the needs that they want. And granted, sometimes there's cases where that works out. Like there a high school that has a freeway going alongside it, and gets environmental activism through an energy company, or Bank of America does financial help for immigrant youth. Sometimes that happens, but in a case where if we want to address issues like gentrification, or if we want to address issues of having students talk about their immigrant stories to address and have a broader image of immigration in the community, like sometimes those fundings don't line up, and like they could say it's like, oh well, we're not here to make immigrant stories, like we're gonna pull our funding. You're not following
Right.
you're not following the track.
Right.
And I think my hope is that like funding through nonprofit is not just a corporate thing, but it can be a community-led thing. It could be like the city investing in it, or local community like entrepreneurs be like, oh, you know what, maybe I can commit even like $50 a month or something to keep this kind of program going, to make sure that there's food in a pantry, or to make sure that so it feels more community led than like it has to be coming through a corporate. Do you
Oh
kind of
yeah,
see where
no,
I'm
I
getting
totally
at?
see
Yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah. Through the years, we know, especially that I would say that I've been blessed that in the three major youth organizations that I've worked with have always had a very unapologetic stance for social justice. And we know with funding, whether it's standing up for undocumented folks, whether it was like the Pico Youth and Family Center in Santa Monica's Pico neighborhood, where we stood up for the youth of color that were being, criminalized and stuff, and we were standing up for gentrification, like, and the Youth Justice Coalition, again, working with system impacted youth and their families, challenging all these stigma. There was funders and city officials that would keep us like 100 feet away, that would never fund and touch and support the work that we did, because we were calling out the system, systemic forms of racism, whiteness, colonialism, colonization, basically trying to name those systems of oppression. And I think what we've learned through the years, and I know there's a big movement that's revolving around what they call social entrepreneurship, or how is there a way to find needs or ways to create economic development and generate resources on one side of the organization, and then on the other side of the organization, then you have the program, the support services, the political advocacy, the organizing, and have one bring resources into the other. And probably the closest model to that, even though they do stay away from political activism, would be Homeboy Industries. They have like the Homegirl Cafe, they have the t-shirt making, they have the tortilla chips making, and they have all their clothing and gear and all that. All that money then goes right into funding all their case management, data, services, hiring folks, like all that. Tia Chuchas in the San Fernando Valley, Tia Chuchas is that model. So they'll sell books. Luis Rodriguez, the founder, he'll go and speak and use honorariums. They'll hire young people. They'll do community events where they have food vendors and everything, and then they kind of charge by organizing it like event planners. But they're all about using a part of their organization and their space to generate revenue, and then have that funding come right into their culture, their cultural identity work, their community empowerment work. So you're right. It's like, where can we go in our community and find these folks that want to take those skills of developing a market, or to generate revenues that would be healthy or create opportunity in our community, and at the same time have those things fund the activist work, the community building work. Because at some point, I really do feel the bust in, depending on corporations or even government grants, is at some point they're going to cut it off.
Right.
None of that has ever been sustainable. In fact, we know from the nonprofit industrial complex, by definition, it rose and came about because it took the money that we were pressing for government to provide social and public services. It basically took it out of their hands and put it in these nonprofits, so it can almost be one step closer to being privatized. So yeah, like we're at a moment where we've got to start to have all these conversations and these visions, of actually looking at what's beyond that model. Because
Yeah.
to me, at some point, neoliberalism will teach us that our fight is going to be for public rights and public access to services. Because if we don't watch it, they're getting privatized.
Yeah, and it's on the perspective of like the work that I do. It's like I just want the freedom just to do the work, you know,
Yeah.
and not have some BS like, oh, by the way, you know, check out Bank of America, or like, oh, check out like this corporate entity that's like in the Southern California area. It's like I want my work to stand on its own, you know, to not have like this idea of like, oh, you did this, oh, it's cool and all, but oh, you also got funding through this, and like, what do you think of their politics? It's like I don't know, I don't follow. It's like they just give us the money to do the work we do, you know, and to be more free and to just do the work versus having to answer to somebody else, you
Right.
know. Yeah.